There was a particular silence in the Ozark Mountains that, according to records from that time, seemed to weigh heavier than the air itself. A silence that thickened before certain stories, as if the landscape knew that something was about to be lost forever. Before we begin, the narrator simply left a brief note in the archives. Record which city you are watching from, and what time it is there now. And it was an almost marginal phrase, but one that has endured over the years along with the case. The story of the 59 travelers who disappeared near the Ozark Ridge attic in 1902 did not begin as a legend, nor as an extraordinary account. It began as an accounting error, an inconsistency in the logbook of a wagon train, and then as a poorly documented investigation by authorities who did not know exactly what they were looking for. The protagonist of this file, although it is impossible to speak of a protagonist when 59 people disappear from the map, was Elias Turner, a 34-year-old carpenter, widowed for just over a year, and father of an 8-year-old girl. He was not the official leader of the group, but later testimony indicates that he was the most respected figure among the travelers. A quiet, reserved but steadfast worker, Elias was known for his ability to keep his cool, even when the weather turned too fast. As the local reverend wrote in 1899, the setting in which this story unfolds, the northern edge of the Ozark Ridge between Missouri and Arkansas, was, in the early 1900s, a territory of dense forests, small isolated farms, and narrow paths that disappeared into deep ravines. The trails were not well mapped, and those who arrived there brought more principles of faith than guarantees of return. The community was made up of scattered families who depended on occasional gatherings in community barns to exchange goods and news. There, a disappearance was not exactly unlikely, but a collective disappearance, and in such a short time, deeply affected everyone. The information we have today is fragmented. Letters exchanged between authorities in the two regions, notes from traveling merchants, the record of a peddler who met with part of the group a few days earlier, and, above all, the incomplete report of the county clerk, dated November 1902. It is in this report that the first mention of the attic near the ridge appears, the old wooden attic at the top of the hill, belonging to a family that had left the region 2 decades earlier. The place was occasionally used by travelers for a brief rest or shelter from sudden rain. According to the documentation, it was there that the 59 were last seen. The archives describe the group as consisting of 3 extended families, 2 young bachelors, 2 seamstress sisters, an itinerant teacher, and a small group of miners seeking work in the quarries across the valley. Each had their own reasons for crossing the region, but the route was well known, traditional, and had been traveled countless times without serious incident. The weather during the week of the disappearance was also widely described in agricultural records. Whitish skies, light winds, lower than normal temperatures for October. Some residents wrote that the air seemed too still, like before an early snowfall but without snow. Details like these, seemingly trivial, would later return to trouble researchers. Witnesses who crossed paths with the group reported a common spirit of fatigue, but not fear. The traveling teacher carried a notebook in which he wrote down the names of the towns he would pass through, and the last name recorded in it was Attic, Ridge, Brief Rest. No additional lines were written after that. From that point on, the documents begin to present uncomfortable gaps. The exact date on which the group should have arrived at the next village, Briar Hollow, does not coincide between reports. Some mention the 14th, others the 15th. A lost report, rediscovered only in 1941, mentions the 13th. These are small discrepancies, but important for historians who have attempted to reconstruct the route. The fact is that none of the 59 travelers checked in at Briar Hollow, and when residents decided to climb the Ozark Ridge Trail, they found only interrupted signs, scattered footprints, recent campfire ashes, and the structure of an abandoned attic, open doors, dust stirred up, and a silence that did not match the recent presence of so many people. But the strangest detail in the files appears at the bottom of page 8 of the clerk's report. A solitary sentence, written in minimal handwriting. There were no signs of departure, and it is from this sentence, simple but impossible, that the mystery begins. When attempting to reconstruct the daily lives of the travelers before their disappearance, small fragments emerge that at first glance seem trivial but become valuable when gathered as part of a record that attempts to withstand the test of time. This is how the daily life of the group, informally led by Elias Turner, took on a more human contour in subsequent investigations. Incomplete letters, shopping lists, statements from residents who saw the train pass by, and even a draft inventory made by Elias himself, probably to organize what would be sold in the next town. The group had left Millstone Creek in early October 1902. Millstone was a simple village with about 40 houses, a store, 2 small churches, and a workshop where Elias had worked since he was 18. A widower since the previous winter, he was trying to reorganize his life alongside his 8-year-old daughter, Hattie. In preserved accounts, Hattie is described as talkative, curious, and her father's shadow, always walking a few steps behind him. It was her way of staying close after her mother's early death. The travelers who made up the group were not close friends, but necessity brought them together on that route. The Worley family, with their 5 children, had lost their plantation to a severe drought and were looking for work in a timber and mining region further ahead. The Sundersons, an elderly couple accompanied by their adult nephew, were trying to return to the farm where they had lived decades earlier, but which they had abandoned after a series of harsh winters. The group was completed by the traveling teacher, 2 recently laid-off miners, and the seamstress sisters, May and Lillian Bramer, always described as discreet but observant. Along the trail, life was simple, consisting of gestures that sustained daily survival: sharing water, organizing campfires, checking the condition of the wagons, sowing tiers in tarps, and keeping away from swampy areas. Each traveler had an unspoken role. Elias took care of the tools and wood for the wagons. The teacher helped the children and, according to reports, entertained the group with nighttime stories about cities that few of them would ever see. The Bramer sisters were in charge of mending, and the miners helped clear the way in the more closed sections of the trail. At each stop, they had a small routine: unload their few belongings, set up shelter for the children, collect firewood, heat water, and only then prepare the meal. It was not a journey marked by urgency, but by necessity. They needed to reach the other side of the ridge before the end of October, when the first frosts made the passage dangerous. Even so, later reports indicate that the group did not show any haste, only a cautious pace. It is at this point that intriguing testimonies emerge, not because they carry explicit mystery, but because they describe small behavioral anomalies that only gained relevance after the disappearance. A peddler named Leonard Hale, who crossed paths with the group 3 days before their last confirmed appearance, reported that some of the travelers looked back with unusual frequency, as if waiting for someone who was late. He even asked if they were waiting for another group, but Elias replied only that no, everything was going according to plan. Still, Hale insisted that there was a subtle tension in the air, like when a group of animals senses a change in the weather before any human notices. Another testimony came from a resident of Redfern Junction, where part of the group stopped to buy flour and kerosene. She described the Bramer sisters whispering about noises in the woods the night before, noises that, according to them, did not sound like animals or people. The resident, however, did not think much of it, as strange sounds were common in the region, especially in dense forests, where the echo distorted any movement. Even the traveling teacher behaved differently, according to some reports. A local farmer who talked to him for a few minutes before they continued their journey noted in his diary that the man seemed restless, holding his notebook to his chest as if afraid of losing it. He had the look of someone who wants to keep something important, but doesn't know how to write enough, the farmer described. None of this, taken alone, was enough to raise suspicion at the time. The travelers' daily routine continued as normal, marked by short stops and quiet nights. But all these fragments, gathered decades later, now form the most consistent set of clues that the group already sensed something. Not a clear threat, but a displacement, a mismatch that they did not know how to interpret. Another curious piece appears in the unfinished letter that Elias was trying to write to his older brother, never sent. Found among the remaining belongings, it contained vague phrases about the trip, the difficulty of keeping his daughter warm during the coldest nights, and a short paragraph that became famous among researchers. "The trail is quieter than I remembered. Even the birds seem to have changed their path." What Elias meant by this remains unclear. The phrase may be just a poetic expression, but to scholars, it suggests that he already noticed some change in the environment, something difficult to describe without resorting to exaggeration. Finally, the records of the last stop before Ridge, a clearing historically used as a resting place, show that everyone ate, talked, and prepared for the final climb. A witness who passed through the clearing hours later reported finding food scraps arranged with unusual precision, as if they had gotten up too quickly but without leaving a mess. "It looked like they had left minutes ago, not hours," he wrote. The last element before the disappearance appears on the final page of the professor's diary. There, just below the entry about the attic at the top of Ridge, he wrote a word that still sparks debate among historians today. Strange. No explanation. No additional sentences. Just that. And it was this small silent record that would become the emotional key to the case. The feeling that something had shifted in the group even before any of them realized what was coming. Reconstructing the group's last confirmed hours requires cross-referencing scattered documents, belated accounts, and notes that survived more by chance than by intentional preservation. Still, the general sequence of events between the afternoon of October 12th and the morning of October 13th, 1902, can be traced with relative clarity until the moment when it simply ceases to exist. The group began their ascent up the narrow Ozark Ridge trail in the late afternoon. It was a steep climb, flanked by tall pine trees, whose resinous scent was described in several contemporary accounts as so strong that it seemed to weigh on the breath. The wind had almost completely died down, creating a continuous silence, uninterrupted by leaves or branches. The children walked close to the wagons, and the adults were more attentive than usual. The miners cleared the way with axes, but the trail was familiar enough not to require extraordinary effort. As they climbed, however, subtle details began to accumulate. Details that were only noticed when investigators pieced everything together years later. A witness from the village of Briar Hollow, who had climbed the trail the morning after the disappearance, said he noticed recent wheel marks in the damp earth, but they stopped abruptly a few meters from the landing where the old attic was located. There were no signs that the wagons had skidded, broken down, or veered off course. It was as if they had stopped there and simply not continued, he reported. According to indirect records, the group arrived at the attic shortly before nightfall. The place, although abandoned, was often used by travelers as temporary shelter. Built by settlers decades earlier, it was a simple wooden structure with a single room, small windows, and a floor that creaked under every step. The door, according to witnesses who saw it days later, was open, as if the group had entered and left without locking it. Documents described that the fire lit outside was still warm when the first local resident arrived in the area the next day. The darkened ashes indicated that it had been used recently. The unfinished firewood next to the fire suggested that someone had gotten up before finishing feeding it. These details were coldly noted by investigators, but for historians analyzing the case today, they serve as sensory pieces that allow us to imagine the scene: the crackling fire, the children sleeping wrapped in blankets, Elias sitting near the door, organizing his thoughts while holding the notebook that would never be found. The night, according to weather records, was unusually clear. The crescent moon illuminated the trail with enough intensity to create long, blurred shadows that cast irregular lines across the wood of the attic. It was the kind of night when any movement against the wind would attract attention. But no subsequent reports mention any unusual noise, and that is precisely what makes it all the more baffling. Some investigators believe that the group retired early, exhausted from the climb. Others argue that some of them remained awake. possibly discussing the next stage of the journey. There is no way to know. What we do know is that the traveling professor used to write before going to sleep, in silence, away from the campfire. He had a habit of recording brief impressions of the day, and the fact that his diary stops exactly at the moment he mentions the attic suggests that something that night interrupted his writing routine. Around midnight, residents at the base of the ridge reported seeing small lights moving slowly along the trail. These lights were interpreted as lanterns from the group, except for one detail. The trail at that point did not allow for horizontal movement, only vertical. The lights seemed to glide from one point to another, as if they were too far away to be ordinary lanterns. The testimony was considered unreliable at the time, as distance and darkness could distort any observation. Still, it was kept in the archives because it coincided with other information. The wind began to blow lightly at that same time, moving branches that had been completely still since early afternoon. The central point of the mystery, however, occurs at dawn, and it is precisely the part of the records where the gaps begin. The county clerk noted that when they arrived at the attic the next day, they found signs of recent presence, but complete absence of the travelers. There were no footprints indicating departure. There were no secondary trails opened. The wagons were lined up as if awaiting the return of their owners. The supplies were organized. The children's blankets were folded on the tarps. Elias's tools were carefully leaning against the outside wall. Everything was as it should be, except for the group. The only mark suggesting movement was a small trail of dust accumulated at the entrance to the attic, but the direction was inconclusive. It could indicate someone leaving or someone entering, and, according to the clerk, there were no signs of a struggle, nor of haste. Investigators who climbed into the attic on the second day found something that would become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. A set of extremely light, almost faded footprints circling the area a few feet from the fire. The marks were so shallow that many believe they were made by children, but other analyses suggest they could be from adults walking slowly, perhaps barefoot. The footprints led nowhere. They just formed an irregular arc around the hut, abruptly interrupted near a moss-covered rock. This rock is another key element. One of the miners in the group, known to carry a small pickaxe with him, had left a mark on it hours earlier, according to analysis of the surface. But when investigators arrived, they did not find the tool. The mark looked recent, as if it had been made the night before. The absence of the pickaxe raises two hypotheses. Either the miner took it with him when he disappeared, or it was used by someone to test the firmness of the rock before moving to another spot. But if the group had decided to move on, leaving the attic, there would be clear traces. The damp ground that early morning would have preserved footprints for hours, and yet there was no sequence of footprints going up or down the ridge. Instead, there was only silence and objects waiting for owners who would never return. The last confirmed evidence appears in the report of a search team sent on the third day. A lamp fallen about 20 meters from the attic, with the glass intact, but the wick worn out. It appeared to have been used recently, and according to analysis of the soot, extinguished by the wind, a wind that had not been recorded as strong enough to knock over or displace objects that night. Next to the lamp, they found a piece of fabric, possibly belonging to one of the Bramer sisters' clothes. It was neither torn nor dirty, just stuck to a low branch, as if it had been touched in passing. The team searched for hours for any trace, but found only disconnected fragments, interrupted footsteps, wheel marks that did not continue, a silence that seemed excessive even for that isolated region. Every detail seemed to reinforce the same feeling. The group had not left the trail. They had not descended. They had not ascended. They had not dispersed. Everything indicated that the 59 travelers had been there, and at some point between nightfall and dawn, they were no longer there. The last entry in the official report, written by the second investigator who visited the site, closes the record book with a sentence that has sparked decades of speculation. Something interrupted the continuity of that night, and it was with this simple, devastating sentence that the case reached the climax of its mystery, a void that even time has been unable to fill. News of the disappearance of the 59 travelers spread slowly throughout the region, almost reluctantly, as if the community did not know what to do with something too big to explain. In the early days, it was believed that the group had simply taken a secondary trail, perhaps detouring because of accumulated mud or fallen trees. But as the hours passed and no one arrived in Briar Hollow, unease began to set in. The local sheriff organized an improvised search team consisting of farmers, 2 miners experienced in rough terrain, and the Reverend from Millstone Creek, who insisted on accompanying the investigation because he knew Elias Turner personally. When they reached the clearing where the group had rested days before, everything seemed as expected. Remains of a campfire, wheel tracks, footprints, until the trail approached the ridge. It was there that the first oddities became official. The team found the wagons intact, positioned side by side with all belongings carefully stored. Barrels, flour packages, tools, folded blankets. Nothing was turned upside down. There was no sign of haste or voluntary abandonment. The prevailing feeling among the investigators, described in several subsequent statements, was that of an interruption, as if an unfinished gesture hung over everything. Years later, the Reverend would recall being particularly touched by the children's belongings. Hattie's little rag doll left on one of the tarps, and a pair of tiny boots placed side by side, as if waiting for the return of the feet that wore them. "Nothing hurts more than order where there should be chaos," he wrote. "Families on the move leave traces. Children leave traces. There were none." The absence of signs of escape or struggle drastically reduced the possibilities. Wild animals? Unlikely. There was no indication of an attack. Voluntary departure? Incompatible with the organization of the belongings. A detour? There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no open side trails. The clay soil would have preserved any movement for hours, and yet there was nothing. The search continued for 3 consecutive days. The group scoured ravines, climbed cliffs, combed narrow valleys, and examined streams that could have washed away objects. They found only 2 additional clues, both fragile and inconclusive. A hair tie caught on a thorn bush and a child's sock soaked on the bank of a stream, but without enough mud to indicate that it had been used recently. Investigators never reached a conclusion about the origin of these items. Meanwhile, at the base of the ridge, the community oscillated between hope and resignation. Residents left water, blankets, and food at the trailhead in case the group was lost and managed to return. At night, some families kept lamps lit in specific windows, believing it would be a way to guide lost travelers. But night after night, no light responded from the top of the hill. As the days passed, rumors began to surface, not out of sensationalism, but out of a human attempt to fill the void. Some said they had heard distant singing, as if a children's choir were echoing in the wind. Others claimed to have seen figures moving among the pine trees at dawn. None of this was officially recorded, and historians consider such reports to be products of the nervousness of that period. Still, they reveal the psychological impact the case had on the region. The most striking revelation of the case, however, did not come from rumors or found objects. It came from a statement by May Bramer, one of the seamstress sisters, except that she was never found. The testimony actually refers to a phrase she had said days before her disappearance, reported by a resident of Redfern Junction. The woman, interviewed weeks later, stated that May had stopped in front of the warehouse door and commented on something seemingly trivial. "Sometimes I feel like our journey is only quiet, because something hasn't started yet." This record, preserved in the final search report, became the phrase that summed up the human dimension of the case. Not because it suggested a threat, but because it revealed an emotional state shared by part of the group, a premonition that they did not know how to express in practical words. In the following weeks, with winter approaching, the search became dangerous. Early snow began to cover trails, erasing late footprints of animals and humans. The exhausted local population gradually accepted that there was no way to continue. The final report, signed by the sheriff and 2 county representatives, concluded, "No signs of displacement, no crossing marks, no evidence of conflict. The cause remains unknown." But a note, handwritten on the back of the last page, probably by the clerk, was preserved even after decades of handling. There was no time for fear. Whatever happened, happened without warning. This sentence, contrary to theories, does not seek to explain anything. It merely expresses the human dimension of the loss. No one had a chance to react, to flee, to call for help. No travelers, neither adults nor children, were found that year, nor in the following years. Not even when search teams returned to Ridge in 1921, 1934 and 1952 to look for traces using more modern methods. But most significant of all is what does not appear in the archives. There are no records of personal items being found in distant communities, no reports of anonymous survivors, no clues indicating voluntary dispersal. The documentary silence is absolute, and it is precisely this absence that would shape the final revelation that modern researchers use to describe the case. It is not about what was found, but what could not be reconstructed. The trail of the travelers did not end. It simply ceased to exist. This is what makes the case so unusual. There is nothing extraordinary, nothing implausible, nothing that requires explanations beyond reality. There are only human beings in motion, and a moment when that motion ceased. The disappearance of the 59 is remembered not for its mystery, but for its interruption. Not for the question how, but for the question when. At what exact minute did they cease to be there? And why did no sign of continuity remain? When the final report was filed, the Reverend wrote one last note in the margin, as if speaking to the future. The story does not end in the attic. It ends in absence. That silent absence, more than any theory, is the true revelation of the case. Decades have passed since the file on the disappearance of the 59 travelers was stored in the bottom drawer of the old county office. The wood of the furniture is already marked by time, and the yellowed paper reveals more fragility than content. But even today, those who hold those pages feel that the silence has not aged. It remains there, intact, like the ridge trail on the morning when no footsteps walked it. The historian who revisited the documents for the last time, now elderly, described in his personal report that studying that case was like trying to hear a conversation through closed doors. There were voices, existences, connections, but all suspended, stuck in the moment before the disappearance. And unlike other old archives, there was no background noise, no echoes, only gaps. He wrote that the mystery lies not in the fact that 59 people disappeared, but in the fact that all traces of continuity disappeared with them. For any historical archive, the absence of records is usually interpreted as human error, technical error, administrative negligence. But in that case, the absence was organized, systematic, consistent with the very silence of the landscape. The ridge attic, restored and renovated several times over the century, remains there, although the current structure is not exactly the same as it was in 1902. The original wood was removed after years of decay, but some boards have been preserved and displayed in a small community museum. There are no special marks or inscriptions on them, just ordinary scratches from use and moisture stains. Even so, visitors often look at these boards with caution, as if they expect some lost trace to be revealed. But nothing is revealed. Over the decades, many scholars have tried to propose explanations: route errors, accidental falls into deep valleys, unexpected crossings to neighboring paths, involuntary dispersion during the early hours of the morning. None of these theories, however, stand up to the records themselves. If the ridge terrain were treacherous enough to swallow 59 travelers in a single night, there would be, at the very least, marks, objects, signs of dragging. If there had been dispersion, they would have found divergent traces at different points. If there had been an escape, someone would have taken supplies, clothes, tools with them. None of this happened. The documentary truth, as frustrating as it may be, is this: they were there, and then they were gone. The historian who analyzed the case in the 1960s wrote a sentence that would become one of the most quoted about the disappearance. Human history is not lost when there is no explanation. It is lost when there are no traces. And it is precisely this lack of traces that sustains the symbolic weight of the case. It is not a matter of imagining extraordinary events, but of recognizing that time sometimes carries away entire portions of human lives without warning. The mountain did not respond, the forest did not respond, and official records have never been able to reconstruct the decisive moment. Over the years, the community of Millstone Creek has learned to speak of the case with a certain modesty, not out of fear, but out of respect. Children who grew up hearing stories about Elias Turner and his daughter learned that absence is also a form of memory, a form that is not written with words, but with spaces left between them. The Reverend, already elderly when he revisited the documents for the last time, wrote a short sentence in the margin of the report, a sentence that many consider to be the true emotional closure of the case. Sometimes what does not return continues to call us. And perhaps that is why the disappearance of the 59 continues to be studied to this day, not out of curiosity, but out of a sense that something remains unfinished, not in the sense of mystery, but in the human sense. There were families, dreams, notebooks, tools chosen out of necessity, small routines of care among travelers who barely knew each other. There was a girl who kept a rag doll in her pocket. There was a carpenter trying to reorganize his life. There were sisters who were seamstresses who laughed discreetly among themselves. There were simple stories, interrupted without warning. No record, however complete, can reconstruct the exact moment of the interruption, but everyone agrees that it was silent, sudden, and definitive. The historian ends his report with a reflection that has become almost an epitaph for the case. The mountain kept what was given to it, and we kept what we could not understand. And so, the file ends. No explanations, no final theories, no conclusions, just silence, and it is that silence that remains.